My guest at this time is former Kansas Congressman Tim Huelskamp. He is now president and CEO of the Heartland Institute. He joins me today to remember the late North Carolina Congressman Walter Jones, who died Sunday at the age of 76. During his 24 years in Washington, Jones developed quite a reputation for his independence, even bucking party leadership to the point that he was stripped of an important committee assignment. It's a consequence Mr. Huelskamp suffered as well. And, sir, thanks very much for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure to join you today.
Well, we'd known for a while that Walter Jones was not well and had recently moved into hospice care. What was your initial reaction when you learned of his passing?
Well, I did know he was struggling and was in hospice, and so I was quite saddened and disappointed. This is quite a loss, not just for North Carolina, but for the entire Congress, because there is no doubt Walter is a friend of mine. Walter was known because he stuck by his principles, which unfortunately is not a very common trait these days in many areas of politics.
And we'll get more into the politics in just a moment. What kind of a man was he?
I have one word to describe Congressman Walter Jones. He is a man of honor. And I told him that all the time. I am from Kansas, and you go back to the Kansas history. We were never too close to folks from the South. But I always imagined that if there was a Southern gentleman, it had to look a lot like Congressman Walter Jones, because that was him. And again, on issue after issue, and Walter and I agreed on so many issues, and there were a few we disagreed, but he knew where he stood. As he often said, there are two things he always focused on in representing. One is to represent them, and that would be his constituent, and to represent him. That would be Jesus Christ, and he always kept those them and him in mind, and oftentimes it was to the consternation of the Republican Party in Washington because he didn't follow the party line. He had them and him to answer first and foremost.
Let's talk a little bit more about what you said a moment ago, Mr. Huelskamp, and that was that he stuck by his principles, which is not an easy thing to do in Washington, and a lot of people in Congress don't do that. Why don't they? I don't think anybody, or at least most people, don't get elected to Congress assuming they're going to compromise on the things they promised to do. So why does it happen, and why do you think it didn't happen to Walter Jones?
I think it has to do so much with why one would like to serve in Congress, and I think everyone certainly must have good intentions. But oftentimes to get elected in today's Congress takes massive amounts of money, and it's usually $2,700 at a time is the maximum check one can give, and you have a lot of folks, and Walter was not among them, that spend most of their time fundraising so they can stay in Congress, so they can keep fundraising to stay in Congress. It's a vicious circle, and in particular, though, when you decide to get off of that or never get on that rat race, and I don't think Walter was ever on that. He said, I'm here first and foremost to represent them and him, but it has to do so much with the fundraising and the money and the control by a certain small group of folks in Washington, the Republican Party establishment, the current leadership, and oftentimes Walter and others, and when they said, you know what, I'm not raising money for you, the speaker at the time, and but I'm working to for the interests of my constituents, and that brought him in conflict with the folks in the Republican Party that said, Walter, you're going to have to support our overseas military engagements, which he's very public about that. They also told Walter, you have to support our efforts to spy on all Americans, and Walter Jones said no, and he also was very worried about the onslaught and ever-growing amount of spending in Washington, D.C., again, which got him in trouble with the party, Republican Party, and the Democrat Party establishments in Washington.
Take us back to that day that you and Congressman Jones and one other member of the Republican conference lost committee spots for not being enough of a team player. I don't remember exactly what the language was at the time, but why were Speaker Boehner and others in the leadership upset with you guys, and how do you remember Congressman Jones reacting to that?
Congressman Jones, again, a man of honor, and I never saw him angry or upset. It was probably in his mind just to be expected, and he wore it as a badge of honor, and he certainly never forgot that, and those that were involved in that, and I think it endeared him more to his constituents than ever before. I think it endeared him as well as to the Democrat Party. As gosh, there's actually a Republican. As a fellow Republican, I would say that Democrats, wonder about parties fight back and forth, but they knew with Walter Jones that whatever he said is what you got, and so he wasn't upset publicly, but he understood that's the price sometimes you pay for standing on principle, and he wore it as a badge of honor. And there's three of us as well that shared in that same attempt by the Republican leadership, and they came after me in the next election and tried to defeat me, and eventually did. They came after Walter and spent, I think, probably millions of dollars of trying to take out Walter Jones. And finally, at the end of the day, it wasn't the Republican establishment. It was his sickness. So to the end, he was a man of honor and commitment. And again, I think that's what American people aspire to see in their politicians. But oftentimes they don't see it happen in our representation in Washington.
A lot of the mainstream media headlines summarizing Congressman Jones are focusing on the fact that at one point he was the guy calling for renaming French fries freedom fries, and then he had a major change of heart on the Iraq War and ultimately became opposed to the ongoing mission there. But there was so much more that characterized his work over almost a quarter of a century, from the right to life to insisting that Congress alone had the power to send our troops into harm's way. So how would you describe what mattered most to him in going about his work? Not just the them and him, as you mentioned, who he was working for, but the issues that also drove him most.
Well, like I said, he's a man of honor and keeping his word and his commitment. And to Walter Jones, the commitment and the word he gave was to his constituents and, of course, to his Creator as well. But he worked every day of his life, and when he thought he made the wrong choice, and the Iraq War was one of those, he felt like he had to do penance for the next 15 years, and I certainly understand that, because, man, he wanted to do his job right. And, whether you're in politics, whether you're in any job, or whether you're, a teenager in the Tim Hillscamp household or wherever, you want to strive to fill and do the job you're called to do. And that was Walter Jones. And he thought of it as an issue of honor. Of course, his father had served as well, But to think about a politician like Walter Jones, that his dad was a Democrat congressman, and he eventually becomes a Republican congressman because he thought it was a matter of principle that the Democrat Party had left him. And so he went to where his convictions took him. And I think even those that didn't like his position, they were really hard-pressed in the Republican Party to go after him and say anything nasty about him. And of course they did. But I think it showed their lack of integrity. It demonstrated his commitment and his conviction to the principles of life and liberty and the Constitution. And when he talked about the responsibilities of Congress, he wasn't talking about just the House and Senate, the general. He was talking about what's Walter Jones' responsibilities under the Constitution. And he took that to heart, and he was a fantastic member of Congress, particularly because of his commitment to his constitutional oath of office.
Last question, Mr. Hillscamp. There's been considerable turnover in the House in the couple of years since you left, but I'm sure you still know quite a few folks up there. Do you feel like there are any Walter Joneses still serving on Capitol Hill?
There certainly are, and there's actually some in both parties, and I understand that. And as a Republican, I can see in my mind, a lot of House Freedom Caucus members, and as Congressman Jim Jordan often says, why don't we just do what we promised to do? The current crop of freshman Democrats coming in a way you give them credit for following through and says they're trying to do what they want to do, even though I'm 100% opposed, And so I think we just need more openness and more follow through, and let the American people judge the next election. Do we need a Green New Deal? I mean, do we need to withdraw troops from Afghanistan? Walter Jones proved to the end that he was committed to those principles. And so we'd like to see more Walter Jones and folks that basically, as Jim Jordan says again, just do what you promised to do, and that's all we can ask. And I can tell you, after serving in elective office for 20 years at the state level and at the national level, that's simply what people are most looking for out of their politicians at the state, federal, and local level. Just do what you promised to do. Fight for your principles and convictions, and just remember what America was built upon: a tremendous Constitution based on life, liberty, and principle happiness.
Mr. Hillscamp, condolences to you on the passing of your friend. Thanks very much for your time today, sir, and helping us take a look back at a very distinct career on Capitol Hill.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you, Greg.
Former Kansas Congressman Tim Hillscamp, President and CEO of the Heartland Institute. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.